Chapter 21 of Prodigal Daughters by Joseph Hocking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kate Follis. Chapter 21. Her Good Friend. "Well, Eleanor, I hear that your father has become more than ever distinguished. Don't you feel exalted?" "Why should I?" "Oh, after all, it's a great thing to be a general's daughter. I hear he's going to be knighted, too. Then you'll be able to refer to your father as Sir Leicester Trelawney, with a lot of letters after his name, while your mother will be Lady Trelawney. Have you written congratulating him?" "No, of course not." "I think I should. After all, it may not be wise to go too far. Of course, I admire your independence and your determination not to knuckle down to him. All the same, I think if I had a father who had distinguished himself as your father has, I should keep on the right side of him. Naturally, I should go along on my own lines, but there would be no harm in being civil." "I don't think it would do any good now," replied Eleanor. "Why?" "Oh, I haven't seen him nor heard from him for several months. I fancy he has crossed me off his books altogether." "Has he told you so?" "No. It's all the other way, I suppose. But I told him, as I told my brother, that I preferred to be without them. I expect they've given me up." "And yet he was awfully cut up when you left home. I know that because he came to the Amazon Club and tried to find out where you were. He and your brother came asking for my address. I knew he didn't want to know anything about me. It was only that he might discover your whereabouts. But he came here, didn't he?" "Yes," replied Eleanor. "He brought mother some days after I left home." "And he got no change out of you?" "No," replied the girl. "I told him flatly that I was going my own way." "And quite right, too. I say, old girl, have you got a drop of whiskey here? I'm as dry as a lime kiln." They were seated in Eleanor's room in St. Hildebrand's Mansions. There were 4 of them. Eleanor, the girl who occupied the rooms with her, whose name was Ellen Chellew, Tamsin Cory, and another named Edith Jeffreys. Earlier in the evening the 4 had dined at the Amazon Club, and after visiting a vaudeville show had returned to Eleanor's flat in order to have a chat before turning in. It was not often that they went out in this way. Generally they had male friends who accompanied them to whatever place of amusement they went to, and often to supper afterwards. But tonight, as they declared, they were "on their own." "I have some whiskey," said Eleanor. "I remember the strafing you gave me for not having any the last time you were here, so I bought a bottle. I don't touch it myself, as you know." "Why not?" laughed Tamsin. "A good stiff nightcap helps one to sleep. I say," she went on, after whiskey and glasses had been set on the table, "is it true that Mr. Wakeham has been paying you special attentions?" "No," replied the girl. "He has been civil, but nothing more." "Oh, you needn't be so touchy about it. Why shouldn't he?" "For the simple reason that he's married," replied Eleanor. "As though that went for anything in these days," laughed Tamsin. "Have a cig, you girls?" producing her cigarette case as she spoke. A few minutes later the little apartment was filled with smoke. "But you have been out to supper with him," cried Edith Jeffreys between the puffs of her cigarette. "I saw you with him at the Orient myself, late at night, too. Did he take you home?" "No," replied the girl. She spoke rather sharply, and in spite of herself could not repress the flush which came to her cheeks. "I'm not that sort," she went on. "In fact, that kind of thing makes no appeal to me. If I weren't fond of dancing and music, I think I'd go in for public work." "Public work?" said Ellen Chellew. "What kind of public work?" "Oh, the independence of Ireland, or, for that matter, a general revolution. I was talking with a Russian the other night, and he asked me whether I would do some propaganda work. It would be great fun." "Did you consent?" "Not quite. I was tempted, though. He offered me a good salary, but I should have to work jolly hard, and I should have no time of my own. I should have to sell myself body and soul to some committee or other, and that wouldn't do for me." "Besides, a revolution would never succeed in England," said Edith Jeffreys. "We're too blanket respectable, too fossilized. Not but what I would like to see one. Wouldn't it be fun to have the whole of our so-called civilization smashed up? I'd give something to see Downing Street occupied by men of the Krassin stamp, and the House of Lords in the hands of revolutionaries. And better fun still to see our pukka generals and colonels doing the goose step to the commands of Trotsky. I say, have you read that book by that Tompkins woman?" "Who's she?" "Oh, a social democrat who went to Russia. She says that the old aristocracy of Russia have been turned out of their big castles and are now begging bread and sweeping the streets. Wouldn't I like to see that here? Fancy General Lester Trelawney acting as office boy to Eleanor." "And is her opinion favourable to the Russian Revolution?" asked Tamsin. "Not very. She's old-fashioned, you know, although she pretends to be a socialist, says she's a Christian, and all that sort of rot." "What I like about the Russian stunt," said Tamsin, "is that it knocked all the old religious ideas into smithereens. I hear that among the intellectuals marriage simply doesn't exist. They practice absolute freedom. In England now, we haven't broken away from the traditions of the old-time nursery." "Oh, but we have!" cried Edith Jeffreys, who was on the staff of the Workers' Record. "What thinking man or woman pays any attention to the 10 Commandments now? Who thinks any the less of a woman in these days because she doesn't keep her marriage vows? I don't. By the way, Eleanor, what are you going to do when Ellen leaves you?" "When Ellen leaves me? I don't understand you." "Haven't you told her, Ellen?" "Not yet," replied Ellen Chellew. "What is there to tell?" "Oh, she's going to try the grand experiment like the rest. But," and Eleanor looked round the room uneasily, "I don't understand. I thought Ellen was a religious girl." "Me religious?" and Ellen laughed scornfully. "I gave that up long ago." "Of course she did," said Tamsin. "Your father was a clergyman, wasn't he, Ellen?" "Yes, I was brought up in a country vicarage. Things were very strict with me, and when I began to know what was what, I kicked over the traces. Of course I had an awful time. You see, Dad was a good sort in his way, but frightfully narrow. Why, we even had family prayers in the house." At this there was laughter. "After a while," she went on, "I went to visit a cousin who lived in Plymouth, and that opened my eyes. When I returned home I got restless, and began to tear up things generally. Then there was hell to pay. Dad began to preach to me, and to tell me what my duties were. I wouldn't stand it, so it ended in my running away from home and getting a government job. I kept pretty straight for a time, and, being desirous of showing my father what I could do, I learnt stenography and shorthand. That enabled me to get the job I have now." "And now you shake a loose leg," laughed Tamsin. "I don't say that," replied the girl, and there was a look in her eyes difficult to interpret. "You see," she went on, "it's a bit lonely here sometimes, and Eleanor is so frightfully straight-laced." "I straight-laced!" Eleanor laughed scornfully. "Yes, you know you are. You're cold-blooded and calculating. I'm not. I hunger for enjoyment and life, and I mean to have it. One can be young but once. There was a curate who wanted to marry me when I was at home. But fancy being a curate's wife. In fact, fancy being a wife at all. I should go mad if I had to settle down to household drudgery." "But," put in Eleanor anxiously, "I thought you were going to marry that man Dingle, who has come home with you several times." "My dear girl," laughed Ellen Chellew, "you can't do here what they can in Russia. Bigamy is a capital crime. George Dingle may not live with his wife, but he's a married man all the same. Still, it's a big risk," she added, "and we women have to think of old age." After her friends left her that night, and Ellen Chellew had gone to bed, Eleanor Trelawney did a little hard thinking. She reviewed her life since she had left home, and wondered whether, after all, she had acted wisely. To be sure, she had rebelled against what she called the absurd restrictions of home, and she grew angry at the thought of what her father had said to her. Nevertheless, she missed the refinements of home life, and realized that there was something beautiful in the atmosphere which had surrounded her childhood. She would not in the slightest degree admit that she was wrong in what she had done. Yet, in a way she could not understand, she felt that there was now something missing from her life. Where was Rod Ravenscroft? She wondered. Did he ever think of her now? She called to mind the evening she had walked with him across Hampstead Heath, and she felt sure that he had been on the point of proposing marriage to her. Of course she would not think of marrying him or anybody. She was not a domestic animal, and would go mad if she were tied down to the drudgery of a housewife. But she admired Rod for all that. He was very honourable, very chivalrous. He was good-looking, too, and clever. In all probability he, like his father, would become a well-known barrister. Perhaps he would go into Parliament and become famous. Yes, she admired Rod greatly, and wondered whether he had heard of what she had done, and what he thought about it. Then her thoughts flew back to her home again, and she remembered what Tamsin Cory had said about the honour which had been conferred upon her father. He was General Trelawney now, and would, in all probability, be knighted. After all, he was a father to be proud of. Of course, she still rebelled against his attitude, and was glad that she had demanded her freedom, but she could not help sighing as she thought about him. Then there was her mother. She was fond of her mother in spite of her weakness and her notions, and felt a stab in her heart as she thought of the pain she and Peg had caused her. What a fool Peg had been to marry that fellow Barnes. She had seen but little of her lately, and Peg seemed sullen and ill-humoured whenever she had called to see her. There had been certain signs, too, that Peg was not happy, although too proud to admit it. She wondered whether Barnes treated her kindly, and whether things were going well with them. Peg had hinted that their flat was very dear, and that they would possibly have to go to one less expensive. "I'd better go to bed," she thought presently, "or I shan't be fit for work tomorrow, and what's the use of worrying about these things? They're done now, and I couldn't stand having my liberties restricted." "Well, Miss Trelawney," said Mr. Wakeham, when she arrived at business the next morning, "you look rather pale. Aren't you well?" Quite well, thank you. That's right. You mustn't get ill, you know. I couldn't bear the idea of my little secretary losing her bloom. Where were you last night, eh? At the Empire, she replied. Naughty, naughty. A bad place for a little girl like you to go without a proper escort. Who went with you? I went with 3 other girls, replied Eleanor. Come now, you don't expect me to believe that, do you? Believe it or not, it's true. But some gentlemen friends went along, of course. No, replied Eleanor. Honest Injun? Honest Injun. Ah, I breathe again. When are we going out together again? I had never thought of it, replied the girl. Of course, it's very kind of you to suggest it. Not a bit of it, replied Mr. Wakeham. I dearly love to take you out. When shall we say? Next Saturday? It would be delightful. That's good. But where? I should like to see the new play at the Haymarket. Oh, that's too tame. What do you say to a vaudeville show, with a little supper and dance afterwards? No, thank you, Mr. Wakeham. I don't think I would care to. But why not? You're young, and a stodgy play won't amuse you. I'm a member of a nice little club where ladies are admitted, and of course I'll be there to look after you. You can get one of your friends to come if you like. What about Miss Chellew and her friend, Mr. Dingle? Thank you, replied Eleanor, but I'm afraid I could not. Isn't it time for us to get to work? I see you have a big pile of letters there. Well, speak to Miss Chellew and let me know tomorrow. And Mr. Wakeham turned rather uneasily to the pile of letters before him. For an hour he dictated letters. You'll get them done quickly, won't you? He said as he finished dictating the last. They'll take me a couple of hours at least, she replied. Oh, well, get them off as soon as you can. He went to the door as he spoke and took his hat. Then he stopped suddenly. Oh, I'm afraid I have something unpleasant to say to you, Miss Trelawney, he said. Unpleasant, Mr. Wakeham? Well, yes. I'm afraid you'll have to get another situation. Why? Don't I give you satisfaction? Don't I do my work well? Oh, yes, it's not that at all. You are simply splendid, but... He came back to the desk again and stood there. The truth is, he said, business is pretty bad just now, and there's a big slump all round. I was talking with the directors yesterday, and they informed me that we shall have to cut down expenses. But I suppose that was to be expected. Of course, we've had a big boom, but now we are in for a bad time, and, well, you see, Miss Trelawney, you have been a little bit of a luxury, haven't you? I hope not, she replied uneasily. It's very difficult for me to talk about it, went on Mr. Wakeham. But, of course, a little time ago, secretaries were at a premium. The army had not been demobilized, and we hardly knew how to get our work done. Now it's all the other way. One can get typists by the score. However, don't trouble, Miss Trelawney. I'll see you're all right. I've been a very good friend to you, haven't I? You have indeed, she replied, looking at his face wonderingly. And you have been a very good little girl, I'll say that. And mind, whatever happens, we must continue to be friends, Miss Trelawney. If the directors say they can't keep you, I'll see that you're all right. You mean you'll get me another place? I don't know about that. Places with anything like a decent salary are difficult for girls to get now. Anyway, don't disappoint me about Saturday. I must be off now. And Mr. Wakeham hurriedly left the room. Eleanor felt greatly depressed as she endeavoured to settle down to her work. She was far from easy in her mind. In spite of the liberal salary Mr. Wakeham reminded her she was receiving, she could barely pay her way. Up to now she had managed comfortably, chiefly because she had brought a fairly large amount of money from home. She had saved a good part of the salary she had received while she worked for the government, and had not spent the whole of her dress allowance. But this was nearly all gone now, and she did not know what she should do if she had to fill another position at a lower salary. Still, it might not be so bad as she feared, and although her heart was heavy, she turned to her notebook and began her work. When she reached St. Hildebrand's Mansions that night, she found Ellen Chellew had already arrived, and noticed that the girl seemed very excited. "George will be here soon," she informed her. "George who?" "Why, George Dingle, of course, my George." "Look here, Ellen," and Eleanor's face became very grave. "Do you realize what you are doing?" "Of course I do. I'm going to enjoy myself. We're going to the Frivolity to see the new show there, and then we are going to the Orient for supper. Don't you envy me? What are you going to do with yourself?" A feeling of loneliness swept over Eleanor. She had made no plans for the evening, and the thought of sitting alone was almost unbearable. She reflected that if what Mr. Wakeham had told her were true, she would have to save her money, and she could not afford to go to a place of amusement that night. Besides, even if she could, the thought of going alone was anything but pleasant. Something akin to frenzy crept into her heart. She had been working very hard all day, and was nervous and irritable. She felt envious too. Why should Ellen Chellew be able to go to the Frivolity and the Orient while she stayed alone? There was no need for it either. If she were not what her friends termed so straight-laced, she drove the thought from her mind, however, and felt a shudder pass over her. Still, "All right, Helen," she laughed. "I hope you'll have a good time. By the way, what are you doing on Saturday?" "I have nothing arranged yet. Why?" "Mr. Wakeham asked me to go with him to the Friv, and then to a supper and dance afterwards." Ellen laughed loudly. "You are going it, my dear." "Why, what's wrong?" "Oh, nothing. Because Mr. Wakeham suggested that you and Mr. Dingle should go too." "Did he? I'll ask George. He's an awfully good sport, ready for anything like that. I'll let you know in the morning." When her friend had left her, Eleanor felt more desolate than ever. Never had the flat seemed so dull and dingy, nor life so slow and worthless. After all, what was there to live for? What did the future offer her? She had decided that no woman with self-respect would tie herself by lifelong vows to any man, to become his chattel, the mother of his children, his house drudge. But what was there else? If only some career lay before her. She thought of some of the women she had met at the Amazon Club. One of them was the sub-editor of a great newspaper, and earning several hundreds a year, met important people, and whose life was full of excitement. She would go and see her. No, she wouldn't. She did not feel like going to the Amazon Club that night. Besides, this Mrs. Brashaw was one of the most pessimistic women she ever met. She was sour, too, and unhappy in spite of her career. There was Tamsin Cory, her best friend. Tamsin was associated with several so-called advanced journals, and regarded as being in the swim of things. But would she like to become like Tamsin? She had not noticed it at first, but Tamsin was often quite coarse, and always a little common. But she had her liberty. Yes, she was free from everything like restrictions, and she was earning her own living. But how precarious everything was! Mr. Wakeham had told her only that day that she might lose her place. What should she do if she did? This little flat, shabby as it was frightfully dear, and if Ellen Chellew did not share the expenses, she could not live there. But even if she could, what then? In a few years her youth would be gone, and her good looks faded. What had she to fall back upon? What prospects had she? Of course, she would not think of going back to Hampstead. She would suffer any fate rather than that. Fancy, after all she had said, to go back at the end of a few months and ask to be reinstated in her home. No, she positively could not bear the thought of settling down to the monotony of her former home life. She started to her feet. "I simply cannot stay here alone," she cried aloud. "I simply can't. I must go out somewhere." It wanted an hour to sunset, and the evening was warm. Where should she go? Without any definite destination in mind, she found her way into Holborn. "I'll have a ride to Hyde Park," she thought. "That's what life amounts to for me, a two-penny bus ride." A minute later she was being swept along the great thoroughfare. The sidewalks were crowded with pedestrians, the street thronged with traffic. For the most part the people were laughing and talking. But she was alone. She wished she had not come out at all. Why could she not have gone to see Peg instead? She had not seen her for several days, and a chat with her sister might, perhaps, cheer her up. No, that would not do. Barnes might be with Peg, and she could not stand Barnes. When she came to Tottenham Court Road, there was a great congestion of traffic, and her bus was held up. She sat still a few seconds, looking at the whirlpool of traffic, and then, acting upon impulse and scarcely knowing what she was doing, she left the bus and made her way to the Hampstead subway. A minute later she found herself in a train which was going in the direction of her own home. When she arrived at Hampstead, she left the train almost by instinct and hurried towards the elevator. Why was her heart beating so rapidly? She was not going home. She would rather die than do such a thing. Nevertheless, she felt excited beyond words. Presently she reached the Heath. Yes, it was better here. The air was purer, and there was a suggestion of country. Children were shouting in their play. Lovers were strolling arm in arm. She was startled at hearing her own name. "Miss Trelawney!" said a voice, and turning she saw a girl who months before had been pointed out to her as Jim Barnes' sister. "Forgive me for speaking to you, but I thought you would not mind. You remember me, don't you? I'm Emily Barnes. Are you living at home now?" "No." "Oh, I thought you might be, seeing you up here on the Heath. Jim told me you couldn't stand the old man's temper, so had gone off on your own. Have you seen Jim lately?" "No." "Oh, for shame. You ought not to neglect your relations, you know." And the girl giggled as she spoke. "Do you mind my walking with you? It was a bit stuffy at home, so I just came up here for a breath of fresh air. It's easy to get here by the subway from Camden Town." "Of course, you can walk with me if you like." "I have wanted to see you for a long time," and Emily spoke confidentially. "You see, Eleanor, you don't mind my calling you Eleanor, do you? For of course we're kind of sisters, aren't we?" But as I was saying, I wanted to speak to you. I'm not comfortable in my mind about Jim and Peg." "No? Anything the matter?" "I'm not sure. Jim was up at our house 2 nights ago, and he was very glum. He says he's going to get the sack." "The sack? What do you mean?" "Oh, there's a slump in the real estate business, as there is in everything else, and his boss says that he'll have to discharge some of his men, and he gave Jim a hint that he might have to go. Jim's awfully proud, you know, and I fancy he's been a bit cheeky." "I'm sorry to hear that." "Yes, well, there it is. That's the thanks soldiers get for defending their country. It's only the bigwigs that get taken care of. Oh, I forgot to congratulate you. Your father's been made a general, I hear. And that leads me to what I was going to say. I don't think your father's acted like a gentleman at all. Oh, I don't mince words. I say straight what I mean." "How hasn't he acted like a gentleman?" "The way he's treated Jim. Jim asked him fair to let bygones be bygones, but your father wouldn't even speak to him. Nasty uppish pride, I call it. I say he ought to make Peg an allowance. 100 or 2 a year would be nothing to him. Why can't he be reasonable and let the 2 families be friendly? If he doesn't, from what I can hear, Jim will have to bring Peg home to Camden Town, and we don't want that. Mother's got enough to do to keep the house straight as it is. And what should we do with Jim home and Peg, with her high and mighty ways? And I shouldn't be at all surprised if there isn't a squalling brat presently. I told him I wouldn't stand for it." Eleanor felt as though she could have screamed. Her nerves seemed raw, and the thought of being associated with this common girl and the rest of the Barnes family was horrible. "I must go and see Peg," she managed to say. "Perhaps things are not so bad as you think." "Well, I shouldn't say they were very good. I don't want to say anything against your sister, but she is extravagant, and never seems happy unless she's either off to a show or a dance. Jim says she won't go to the movies. They're not good enough for her. I give you fair warning. Jim won't stand too much nonsense, and if something isn't done, there'll be ructions. You, Eleanor, I think, might help them." Eleanor writhed as she heard the girl calling her by name, and had difficulty in controlling herself. "How can I help them?" she asked rather sharply. "I have to work for my own living, and have only a small salary." "Oh, tell that to the Marines." "But I haven't." "That won't do. Here you are, living on your own with another girl in a flat. I've heard all about it. Miss Chellew has her fine clothes and jewelry, and goes to expensive places of amusement. Does she do it on her salary? Don't tell me." And the girl laughed knowingly. A flush of shame passed over Eleanor's cheeks. "I have nothing to do with what Miss Chellew does," she said angrily. "Oh, haven't you?" Miss Barnes laughed incredulously. "But a friend of mine saw you at the Orient not so long ago. You were there with a gentleman, drinking champagne. Does that come out of a typist's salary? Don't tell me. You can help Peg if you like, and I think you're mean if you don't. Jim knows all about Mr. Wakeham. He's no plaster of Paris saint, and would never get mistaken for a preacher." The girl's evident meaning drove Eleanor Trelawney nearly mad. "Miss Barnes," she said, as her voice trembled, "I came here to be alone. Would you mind telling me which way you are going?" "What do you want to know that for?" "Because I'll go in the opposite direction." "Oh, you will you? I suppose that although my brother's married your sister, I'm not good enough to walk with you. But let me tell you this, miss, I'm as good as you are, and I don't go to fast restaurants with married men." Eleanor looked around her helplessly, and as she did so she wished the ground would swallow her up. Close beside her, so near that he could not have helped hearing what was said, was Rod Ravenscroft. By his side was a handsome, well-dressed girl whom she had never seen before. But whoever she was, it was easy for Eleanor to recognize her as belonging to that class of people with whom she herself formerly associated. Ravenscroft lifted his hat and passed on without a word, but Eleanor saw the expression in his eyes. He must have heard what the girl had said, and have understood the significance of her words. Never had she felt so humiliated. What must he think? What must the girl by his side think? Possibly they were talking about her now. Probably he was telling her that she was the daughter of General Trelawney. She rushed away while the girl Barnes laughed aloud, jeeringly, tauntingly. Whither she was going she did not know, did not care. Oh, it was horrible, horrible. Presently she had time to think over what had taken place, but it was not of what Emily Barnes had told her about Peg that filled her mind. Who was this girl who was out walking with Rod Ravenscroft? What were they to each other? Was she his fiancée? She must get away. It did not matter where, except that she must get away as far from Hampstead as possible. Half an hour later she was back in her shabby little room again, recalling every incident of what had taken place since she left. Her brain seemed on fire. To think that she, Eleanor Trelawney, daughter of General Trelawney, should be spoken to in such a way by this common woman. And then there was the trouble about Peg. Her sister would go mad if she had to live with the Barnes family. How could she bear being in constant association with Jim Barnes's mother and his two sisters? And the worst of it was, she, Eleanor, could not help her. Her own position was insecure. She might lose her place at any time, and what then? She called to mind Mr. Wakem's words. She remembered the looks he had given her. What did he mean by the insinuations he had thrown out? In a way, he had always been respectful to her, yet... Hour after hour she sat thinking. She did not heed the lapse of time, and presently, when she heard Ellen Chellew's voice, she seemed like one awakened out of an awful dream. "Won't you come in, George?" "Not to-night, girlie? Oh, well, then, just for a minute." "How do you do, Miss Trelawney? Sitting here alone? Now that's downright sinful. You ought to be out enjoying yourself. Nell and I have had a jolly time. By the way, I'm good for Saturday night, so we'll regard that as settled. Now I must go. Good night, Miss Trelawney. Good night, Nell. My pet bird, give us another kiss." The man's voice sounded thick, as though he had been drinking more than was good for him. "We've had a glorious time!" exclaimed Ellen after he had gone. "The review was splendid, and George and I drank a whole magnum of champagne. We will have a time on Saturday night." "I don't think I shall go," said Eleanor. "Oh, but you must. It's settled. George said he would ring up Mr. Wakeham tomorrow and fix it up, so you can't back out now. Besides, what's the odds? Let's enjoy ourselves while we can." When Eleanor arrived at the office next morning, Mr. Wakeham was not there, for which fact she was much relieved. She did not know why, but she seemed to be standing on the brink of an awful chasm. Her troubles seemed to have come upon her all at once. What should she do if she lost her position? How could she meet the future? And how could she help Peg? Was there any truth in what Emily Barnes had said? As for Rod Ravenscroft, she had driven him out of her mind, at least she thought she had. What was he to her? She had told him that the very idea of marriage was nauseating to her, and he, of course, he had forgotten her, and if he had become fond of some other girl, what was that to her? When Mr. Wakeham came to the office about 11 o'clock, she was uneasy at the look he gave her, and the way he spoke. "Well, it's all right about Saturday, isn't it?" he asked. "I'm afraid I cannot go, Mr. Wakeham. It's very kind of you, but I don't think I could manage it." "Oh, but you must. Why, it's settled. I saw Dingle a few minutes ago, and he told me you had consented, so I've booked seats. You can't back out now, you know." "I'm afraid I must, Mr. Wakeham. By the way, I hope what you told me yesterday about losing my situation here isn't true." "I'm afraid it is," replied Mr. Wakeham. "Yes, I'm afraid it is. But don't trouble your little head about that. I'm not going to leave my little friend in the lurch. I haven't time to talk with you about it now, though. I can on Saturday. We'll find some quiet corner, and then I'll tell you." "Do you mean that you can help me find another place?" she asked eagerly. "I think I've got it all mapped out," he evaded. "But there must be no backing out, you know. And by the way, I'm just off to Birmingham and shan't be back until Saturday. However, it's all right. The seats are all booked, and I'll call at your place about 7 o'clock." He took a step nearer to her, as if to say something, then apparently thought better of it and left the room. During the next 2 days Eleanor was in a state of mind difficult to describe. But when the evening of Saturday came, she had evidently come to a decision. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Prodigal Daughters by Joseph Hocking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kate Follis. Chapter 22. The Night Club Affair. That decision was that she had resolved to accept Mr. Wakeham's invitation. She felt rather nervous about it, but why should she? She could take care of herself. Besides, she had ulterior purposes in deciding to go. She remembered what Mr. Wakeham had said about the possible loss of her position, and of his promise to find her another. At that moment she could not afford to offend him. If Ellen Chellew had decided to leave her, then she must find some other place of abode. But where? Her whole nature revolted against herding with girls of a lower social and intellectual life than those with whom she was brought into contact now. Of course there were thousands of respectable girls in London who earned their own living and stopped at cheap boarding houses and fourth-rate private hotels. But she could not bear the idea of staying at one of these. Her liberties would be restricted, her times of going out and coming in discussed. No, she had not left Hampstead for that. She had thought, and thought bitterly, about what Emily Barnes had told her about Peg, and she was very miserable as a consequence. After all, she was her sister, and she had some duties towards her. Could she not help her and solve her own problem at the same time? The thought was horrible to her, but if she could join with Peg and Barnes in a flat, she could perhaps help in the rest, and pay enough for her own keep to be of assistance to them. But to do that, she must keep on the right side of Mr. Wakeham. She knew he had told the truth about the slump in trade, and the consequent unemployment which existed. Especially was this true, and increasingly true, with regard to girl workers, and she doubted whether any place of business would give her her present salary unless she had friends at court. Indeed, she would be dependent upon Mr. Wakeham for a reference. Of course she was very angry at Emily Barnes' insinuations, but she could afford to laugh at them. What had she to do with conventions? And what if Mr. Wakeham were a married man? It was quite common for married men to take out single girls. Besides, it was necessary for her to be polite to him. So she determined to be very pleasant, and to that end dressed herself in the clothes she thought became her best, and looked forward to a pleasant evening. She was passionately fond of music and dancing, and loved dramatic displays of every sort. One thing, however, troubled her. Ellen Chellew had informed her that she would not be able to go with her. "But why?" asked Eleanor. "Oh, George and I have other plans," giggled the girl mysteriously. "But it's all right, Eleanor. You go and enjoy yourself." "Where are you going? Why can't you come with us?" "Never mind. We shall be all right." So, in spite of her disappointment in this direction, she dressed herself carefully, and made her way to the Frivolity Theatre. Mr. Wakeham had pleaded hard that he might call for her at her flat, but to this she would not consent, and at the time appointed she found herself at the theatre entrance. "Hello, Eleanor," Mr. Wakeham greeted her. "Here you are, and by Jove, you look beautiful. I never saw you looking so pretty before. Every man who sees you will envy me." "I didn't know I had given you permission to call me by my Christian name," she said, a little uncomfortably. "Oh, we're not at business now," laughed Wakeham. "We're out for a good time. Of course you're Miss Trelawney at the office. We have to keep up appearances there. But to-night you are my little Eleanor. Won't you call me Dick?" "Certainly I shall not." "Oh, but you will before the night's over," laughed Wakeham. "You know I'm a little bit vexed with you." "Why?" "Because you wouldn't come and have some dinner with me before the show. One can always enjoy the programme better after a bottle of fizz." Evidently Mr. Wakeham had had his bottle of fizz, for his large fleshy face was flushed, and he was very garrulous. "Still," he went on, "you are here, and we're going to have a great time." A few minutes later Eleanor was under the thrall of the performance. She loved this kind of thing. There was something in the bright lights, the gay colouring, the sound of the music, and the whole atmosphere of the place, which intoxicated her like wine. Here, at all events, there was, to her, nothing of the grim sordidness of life. Here the best talent in London laid itself out to amuse her. The orchestra was excellent, the dresses gay, the singing was entrancing. The theatre was filled to the doors. Every sight and sound spoke of wealth and pleasure, and an abandonment to the spirit of the moment. The review itself was tawdry and silly. It did not pretend to be anything else. The Frivolity was not a place for serious things. It ministered not to the mind, but to the senses. Often the jokes bordered on vulgarity, if not on the indelicate, but no one seemed to mind. People did not come there to study the problems of life, or to look at life as it really was. The scores of half-drunken youths who had brought their painted inamoratas would have been angry at the slightest approach to the serious. Let us laugh and be merry was the spirit of the whole place. Morality was laughed at, infidelity of wives towards husbands and husbands towards wives, something to make a stage joke about. The play, if play it could be called, went on its way. Scene followed scene, dance followed dance, joke followed joke. painted, tinselled, half-dressed girls capered on and off the stage. The music was sensuous, ravishing. Light, colour, laughter abounded everywhere. "Now this is the thing I like," laughed Mr. Wakeham. "This is the kind of show that appeals to me. Pretty girls everywhere, good music, beautiful dancing, bright colours. Do you see that girl there at the end of the first row in the ballet? See her diamonds? They're worth 500 if they're worth a penny. Pretty, ain't she?" "Yes, a beautiful girl," replied Eleanor. "Her mother was a scrub woman in Battersea," laughed Wakeham. "Her salary's £2 a week. She lives in a beautiful flat, and keeps her motor car. I know who pays for 'em too, but what's the odds so long as she's got 'em?" At that moment Eleanor almost felt as though Wakeham were right. It was all over presently, and they left the gaily lighted theatre for the streets. Outside the crowds surged hither and thither, but Mr. Wakeham had everything carefully arranged. A motor car awaited them, into which he ushered her. "I would take you to the Savoy or the Carlton," he said. "The grub's good there, so is the wine. But they have their closing hours, and the place we're going to is free from all that kind of rot." A vague sense of discomfort possessed Eleanor, but she said nothing. She was still under the influence of the review that had entranced her. The car threaded its way through the quickly moving traffic, and presently she found herself in a part of London she did not recognize. "This is the way, Eleanor, my dear," said Mr. Wakeham, as he dismissed the car, and although the place at which they stopped was dark and unattractive outside, it was full of light within. "I booked a table in a nice cosy corner," he laughed. "Now then, we'll have a jolly little supper." Certainly the cuisine of the place was excellent. The dishes were prepared by a genius. Whatever else the place possessed, it was able to tickle the palates of its clients. It was filled with a gay throng, too. People of seemingly all nationalities chattered and laughed, what time the orchestra discoursed gay music. "This is something like it, isn't it, old thing?" leered Mr. Wakeham. The waiter filled her glass as he spoke, and she drank almost with avidity. The hot, fetid air parched her throat. She did not think about the kind of people about her. That did not matter. Nothing mattered, it seemed to her, but the pleasure of the moment, and she felt strangely light-hearted. The wine, too, was exhilarating. She felt it tingling through her veins, making sadness impossible. She could not understand why she had been troubling about things. After all, what was there to trouble about? On every hand was laughter and music. In the near distance couples were footing merry music, and she was submerged in the whirlpool of the life she found there. "Won't you have another glass?" asked Mr. Wakeham at length, when they had finished supper. "No, I've had enough," was her reply. "Thank you very much. It has been splendid." "Yes, they do very well here, don't they? I thought you would like it. Now we'll go into the dancing room and have a hop." They passed from the restaurant into a large gilded hall, where the ceiling was decorated to appear as though it were the dome of the blue sky. "Best floor in London, Eleanor," said Mr. Wakeham. "Shall we take it right away, or will you sit down a minute?" Eleanor sat down and watched the revelry, and as she did so a kind of dizziness possessed her. The wine had flown to her head, and while she was completely master of her movements and collected in her thoughts, she was under its influence. She looked around among the dancers and watched their senseless capering. In fact, it was not dancing at all. Half-tipsy youths gyrated with tipsier girls. Their class was plain at a glance. Some were in their teens, girls of 16, 17, and 18, who had been carried away by the flood of so-called pleasure. How they got there, God only knew. Older women were also there, with womanly modesty all gone. Some could not hide the signs of dissipation and late hours in spite of paint and powder. Evidently Mr. Wakeham was not a stranger there. Acquaintances, both men and women, came up and spoke to him. Formal introductions were unnecessary, and one man, whose character was plainly written in his face, sought to enter into conversation with Eleanor. "The floor's a dream," he said. "Mayn't I have the pleasure?" "No, not yet, old man," objected Wakeham. "A bit later, perhaps, but the first dance is for me. Isn't it, Eleanor?" She was utterly bewildered. She was still under the influence of the theatre, while the wine she had drunk still banished all thought of care. Yet at the background of her mind was wonder, almost shame. She remembered that not one word had been said about a new position, and amid all the wild laughter and revelry it was impossible for her to think clearly. Then something happened which opened her eyes. A man entered whom she knew. By his side was a woman whose class was written upon her face. Eleanor took but little notice of her. It was the man who frightened her. She knew little of him, but his house was not far from that of her father's at Hampstead, and she had more than once met him. "What if he should see me?" she almost gasped, and then she realized where she was. Yes, what if he were to see her and recognize her? What if he were to tell her father and mother? And what if he were to tell Rod Ravenscroft? Of course it did not matter. She had cut off all her old associations, but the thought haunted her nevertheless. Why had she come here? And why had not Ellen Chellew accompanied her? A group of tipsy girls came up to her and spoke familiarly. She could see the paint and powder on their cheeks, and they reeked with wine and tobacco smoke. They claimed her as belonging to their class, the saddest, the most tragic class in the world. Great God, the horror of it! "Come, Eleanor, darling, shan't we take the floor?" said Mr. Wakeham. "Here, have another glass of fizz, and then we'll start." "No, not yet," replied the girl. "I don't feel like dancing now. Besides, you told me that you would tell me about the new position you have for me." "Position?" laughed Wakeham. "This isn't the place to discuss things like that, my pet. This is the place to enjoy ourselves. Come on." Almost without resistance, she allowed him to put his arm around her while they kept time to the music. Then she thought she saw the man she knew at Hampstead looking at her, and a cry of terror escaped her. "I really can't stay here any longer," she cried, almost hysterically. "I want to go. I really must go. Don't trouble to come. I can find my way." "Why, the night's young yet," laughed Wakeham. "Besides, I couldn't think of letting you go alone. When you go, I go." "Then it must be now. I really can't stay here any longer." The excitement caused by the wine had gone, and Eleanor felt frightened beyond words. Suddenly the lights went out, and a frenzied cry went round the room. "The police are here! The place is being raided!" A feeling of terror possessed her. She had paid little attention to the information about raiding night clubs, but now she knew. If the police took possession of the place, what would happen to her? She dreaded exposure. What would her father and mother say? What would Rod Ravenscroft think? "It's all right, Eleanor," whispered Wakeham. "I know a way out. Come with me. I've been in this kind of thing before." Cloakless and bareheaded, she allowed him to lead her along some tortuous passages. Evidently he was as anxious to avoid detection as she, and that fact gave her some comfort. A few seconds later they were in the street. "Don't worry, Eleanor," laughed Wakeham. "We've dodged 'em all right. My, but that was a narrow escape. It wouldn't do for Speke and Burnham to know that I'd been here." A minute later he hailed a passing taxi, into which he handed her, and then took his seat by her side. "Where to?" asked the driver. "St. Hildebrand's Mansions," informed Wakeham with a laugh. "But take your time." "But really, you must not come with me," pleaded Eleanor. "Of course I must," said Wakeham. "I haven't told you yet of the position I've got for you," and he laughed hoarsely. "Then tell me quick," she almost gasped. "And then you must really get out. I want to be alone." "Come, come now, Eleanor. But yes, I'll tell you." Then he whispered something in her ear. The girl gave a cry of terror. "Now be sensible, my dear," pleaded Wakeham, and began to talk very volubly. "No, no, please stop," she gasped. "Nonsense! That won't do, Eleanor." Then he put his arm around her and tried to kiss her. The girl, frenzied with fear and mad with anger, fought him with all her strength and screamed aloud. "You little devil!" cried Wakeham, mad with pain. "You're tearing my eyes out. Stop it, I say." The driver, hearing the cry, jammed down the clutch and placed his other foot heavily upon the brake. The girl, unheeding Wakeham's threats, managed to open the door and leap into the street. Where she was she did not know. She was filled with a rage and fear and shame. Unmindful of passers-by, and not knowing whither she was going, she ran until she was out of breath. Then she stopped and tried to collect her thoughts. She was aware that two men were speaking to her, speaking in thick voices. It was now past midnight, and she did not know where she was. She was helpless, too. She had brought no money with her. What the men said to her she did not know, but she did know that their presence was evil, and that one of them was a man who had spoken to her an hour before in the night club where she had been. "Leave me!" she cried angrily, "or I'll call the police." "You call the police?" laughed the man. "That won't do, old thing. You daren't call the police. If you did, you'd get into trouble, my dear. You're only drunk, that's all." What she said she did not know. She hardly realized what was taking place, except that she was alone in London with two drunken men. She continued to protest, however, to protest angrily and helplessly. Oh, if she had someone to protect her! If only her brother John were there! If only. Then, as if by a miracle, a change came over the scene. Almost instinctively she felt as though a helpful presence were near her. "Miss Trelawney?" said a voice. "Surely that can't be you?" "Oh, help me, Rod! Mr. Ravenscroft, save me from these horrible men!" Rod Ravenscroft turned on them fiercely. "What have you to do with it?" replied the more drunken of the two. "It's none of your business. We know what she is. We know where we saw her an hour ago. She's drunk, too. We saw her running like a mad woman. That's why we spoke to her." "Take me away," panted Eleanor. "I want to get home. Give me your arm. Will you, Mr. Ravenscroft?" A little later she was hurrying away by Rod Ravenscroft's side, while the men laughed loudly and shouted obscene raillery. "How came you here, Miss Trelawney?" asked Ravenscroft. I don't understand." "Oh, don't ask me," she pleaded. "I want to get back to my flat. I live at St. Hildebrand's Mansions. It's all a mistake. I ought not to be here at all. But please don't ask me any questions. I can't bear it just now." "Let me see you back to St. Hildebrand's Mansions," said Ravenscroft, still bewildered. "Or better still, there's a taxi passing. I'll call it." He hailed it as he spoke, and Eleanor, feverishly, pantingly, entered. "May I come with you, Miss Trelawney?" he asked. "Oh, if you only would! I wouldn't trouble you, but I'm afraid. It's all been so horrible." Without a word, he took his seat by the girl's side, while she crouched in the corner of the conveyance, trembling and fearful. "You're not ill, are you, Miss Trelawney?" he asked anxiously. "No, no, not ill. Please don't speak to me. And She was on the point of asking him not to tell her people how he had found her, but the words would not pass her lips. In a few minutes the taxi stopped at the entrance to the gloomy block of buildings where she lived, and she got out. "Good night, Mr. Ravenscroft, and thank you. Oh, I don't know how to thank you." He watched her as she rushed into the vestibule and disappeared from view. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Prodigal Daughters by Joseph Hocking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kate Follis. Chapter 23. The Horror of the Awakening. When Eleanor entered her cheerless room, she found it in entire darkness. Ellen Chellew had not returned. Switching on the light, she locked the door. What if Wakeham should follow her? Presently, as no one came, and the silence of the night had fallen upon that part of London, she felt more calm and collected. She was able to think, and to understand what had happened. Oh, the horror of it all! The brutal, naked horror! She felt she had become years older in a day. 100 things which had been mysteries were explained, and the explanation was ghastly beyond words. What should she have done if Rod Ravenscroft had not appeared? It was only a chance in 1,000 that he was passing there at that moment. Supposing he had not seen her, recognized her? She shuddered at the thought of it. And what must he think? He had heard what those men had said, every word of which burned like fire into her brain. He must despise her. He must think her... Then the secret of her life became plain to her in a second. Without warning, and seemingly without reason, her whole nature was revolutionized in a moment. She, who had laughed at the thought of love, knew that for weal or for woe she loved the man who had rescued her that night. She felt as though she were going mad. Horrible as had been her previous experiences, they were as nothing to this. Suddenly it had come to her that Rod Ravenscroft was all the world to her, come to her at the time when he must be thinking of her with loathing and scorn. She could not understand it at all. Hitherto she had thought of him kindly and regarded him as a pleasant fellow, but utterly old-fashioned and conventional. On 1 or 2 occasions before her father came home, she had gone with him to places of amusement with her mother's consent and approval. More than once, too, she had had an idea that he was fond of her. But as for caring for him, the thought had never seriously appealed to her. For that matter, she had regarded herself as incapable of love, and had felt a kind of contempt for girls who would sacrifice the liberties and privileges of girlhood to become the wife of any man. And now everything had changed. It seemed to her as though some new part of her being had been called into life, and that everything else in her past was submerged in this new, wonderful passion which possessed her. She did not know whether she admired him or not. She had a feeling that he was strong and chivalrous, and that he suggested safety and confidence, but somehow these things did not seem to matter. He was the only man in the world for her, and all her past dreams seemed like so much mockery. Her heart went out to him in its entirety. All the wealth of her being was given to him. He was her king, her all. She would brave anything for him, do anything to serve him. If... But no, it was too late now. She had made everything impossible by her own actions. What did he think of her? Her mind swept back again over the events of the evening. She saw herself accepting Wakem's invitation and going with him to the tawdry music hall. She remembered his coarse, vulgar laugh, and his still coarser remarks which she had listened to and not rebuffed. And then there was the horror of the night club afterwards. She had found herself in a place which was the resort of bad women and worse men. It was true many so-called society women went to such places. They went there to see life, as they termed it, but she found no comfort in the thought. The horror of that hour haunted her. She remembered the coarse girls who came and greeted her so familiarly, called to mind their painted lips and cheeks, their coarse laughter, their silly, vulgar chatter. And she had been there among them. She had allowed herself to be accompanied by a man who was a member of the club. Perhaps by this time the police had taken possession of it, while the names of those who had been there would on the following day be published to the world. From what had she escaped? But that was not the worst of it. It was the hour which followed. Wakeham had spoken to her as though she were a thing to be bought and sold. He had made suggestions which made her wish that the earth would swallow her up. She felt demented, horror-stricken. This, then, was the actual outcome, the grim and ghastly logic of Tamsin Cory's so-called advanced views. She felt that her womanhood was besmirched at the thought of it. Then she recalled that other scene when, after a mad struggle, she had managed to get into the street and had fled from what now appeared to her in its ghastly nakedness. She thought of the drunken men who had spoken to her, of the words they had said to her, and then came Rod Ravenscroft. What must he think of her? Yesterday she professed not to care, but today, now, the world had become changed. She hungered for the love she had scorned, hungered for the love she had laughed at, and she had made everything impossible. How wise her father had been, how kind, and she had spurned his kindness. Oh, if he would only come to her now and speak to her as he had spoken to her months before. And then there was Peg. She had aided and abetted her in her mad determination to marry Barnes. She was largely responsible for the tragedy of it all, for it was tragedy. For the first time she saw things as they really were. She saw Barnes as he really was, a low-bred, vulgar outsider, a man who was common to the finger-tips. And she had half encouraged Peg in her mad infatuation for him. If what his sister said was true, Peg's whole life might be ruined, and she, because of the attitude she had taken, was largely responsible for it. Hour after hour, heedless of the passing time, she sat thinking. The night was wonderfully still. London was asleep. Presently she looked at her watch. It had stopped. Then she heard one of the city clocks striking. It was 3 in the morning. Why had not Ellen Chellew come? Where was she? She remembered the conversation which passed between them before she went out. She called to mind what Ellen had said. Then the meaning of it all became plain, ghastly plain. She shuddered and hid her head in shame. This was what loose conceptions of marriage really meant. This was the outcome of discarding the old religious beliefs in which she had been reared. And but for what seemed like a miracle, she At length tired brain and body could bear no more. She threw herself on her bed and fell into a troubled sleep. When morning came she awoke with a great weight on her heart. Something horrible had happened. At first she could not tell what, but presently it all flashed back to her. But she was less excited now and could think of things more calmly. She realized that she had her future to face, and she must think what to do. She counted her money carefully, and as she did so the grey drabness of her prospects rose before her again. First of all, she determined not to go back to Speke and Burnham. After what had happened the night before, it was impossible. She simply could not sit in the same room with a man who had insulted her pride, insulted her womanhood. The very thought of it made a flush of shame rush madly to her cheeks. She would starve rather than live in the poison of that man's presence. Neither would she go home. That was as impossible as the other. How could she? She called to mind what had passed between her and her father, remembered too what she had constantly said to her mother, for Eleanor Trelawney's pride was unconquered. All sorts of questions would be asked her, and No, she simply could not. She had left home because she wanted to live her own life, and although she felt she had been a failure, a miserable failure, she could not go back humbled and penitent. But what could she do? It was true she might be able to find a position in the city, but any respectable employer would want references. If she mentioned Speke and Burnham, they would naturally refer the matter to Wakeham, and she felt sure of what Wakeham would say. Besides, she simply could not be beholden to that man. But she must find work, else she would starve. She remembered the Russian who had offered her, whether seriously or not, she was not sure, a post in some organization which existed for the purpose of Bolshevik propaganda. He had mentioned a good salary, too, but her heart gave no response to the suggestion. These people did not stand for law and order and decency. These Bolsheviks not only scouted the idea of God, but of all Christian morals. She remembered a sentence which this man had said to her. Religion is a sort of opiate, and opiates are always bad. Religion has no place in the life of a thoughtful man. She could not help thinking of her father at this moment. He had given his life to the establishment of order and decency. How then could she work for that which he had offered his life to avert? But what could she do? That was the question which haunted her with grim persistence. A few minutes later she sat down to her lonely breakfast. Outside the church bells were ringing, calling people to worship, but she had no thought of worship. Her mind was too filled with the drab persistence of sordid facts. Almost mechanically she washed the few breakfast utensils which she had been using, and then stood still. "I'll go and see Peg," she said. "I've neglected her." She was on the point of putting on her hat and jacket when she heard a step outside her door. Then someone knocked. Could it be Wakeham? Had he dared to hunt her in this fashion? But she was not afraid now. Daylight gave her confidence, and a score of people were within call. The knock was repeated. Her heart beat wildly, why she could not tell. But she went to the door and opened it, and saw Rod Ravenscroft. Instantly her face was suffused with a flush of shame. She called to mind their meeting on the previous night, remembered what had taken place. Then pride came to her aid. Not for worlds would she let him see or even suspect what she felt towards him. "Good morning, Miss Trelawney. You'll forgive my calling, won't you? But I thought you looked ill last night." "You are very kind," she replied quietly. "Won't you come in?" He entered the room hesitatingly, awkwardly. He, too, remembered the previous night's experience, and felt sensitive. As a consequence he tried to find something to say in order to explain his presence, but nothing would come. He was but a simple-hearted fellow, in spite of a brilliant university career, and he was not an adept in talking with girls. Besides, the circumstances were peculiar. By this time Eleanor had been able to obtain control over herself. Somehow, why she could not say, he had given her a sense of confidence. "Won't you sit down, Mr. Ravenscroft? And will you please excuse me while I get the room into something like order? I did not expect a visitor." She was glad she was able to speak calmly. Not for worlds would she let him know what she felt. Last night she had been mad with fear and terror, and as a consequence she felt abject, penitent. But now the old fighting spirit had come back again. She loved him beyond words, but she would do anything rather than let him know it. For a few minutes they talked on trivial matters, and never once did he refer to the predicament in which he had found her. But Eleanor knew what he was thinking, and while she dreaded explanations, she longed to stand well in his eyes. But how could she explain away what he had seen and heard? "Have you been to Duloe lately?" she asked at length. Duloe was the name of the parish in Cornwall where the original Trelawney mansion was situated, and this had perhaps led General Trelawney to give his house at Hampstead that name. "No, not for 2 or 3 weeks," he replied. "But I sometimes call. You see, John is a great friend of mine." "You have not been there this morning?" He shook his head. "No, Miss Trelawney." "I suppose you have been wondering at the predicament in which you saw me last night," she stammered. "I'm very glad I happened to be passing," was his reply. "I had been spending the evening with some Oxford friends. We all met at the chambers of Dick Pascoe, and I had not left them more than a few minutes before I saw you. I was afraid you were in trouble." Her face crimsoned with shame. She longed to let him know the truth, but she could not. Her mind was torn by conflicting influences. "I suppose you feel it your duty to inform them at Duloe of what you saw?" she blurted out presently, and she was angry with herself the moment the words had passed her lips. "I don't think I deserve that, Miss Trelawney." "Come now, confess." And she tried to speak lightly. "Haven't you felt all the morning that you ought to go to General Trelawney and tell him that you saw his daughter under the most distressing circumstances, and that but for you something terrible might have happened to her?" "And if I did?" he flashed back. "Wouldn't it have been natural? Yes, I will be quite frank and candid with you. I will take the liberty of an old friend. I will even go farther than that. I will take the liberty of one who, a few months ago, dared to hope great things. But of course that is all gone now." She misunderstood his meaning, and a kind of despair came into her heart, which was mingled with an unreasoning anger. And why have you come here this morning?" I hardly know why. I came, I think, because I wanted to help you." "Why would you want to help me?" "Because you need help. I am sure of that." "Yes," she laughed, "I do need help. I need help in getting a position. I've lost my place." Her voice was hard and bitter. "Come, Miss Trelawney," pleaded Ravenscroft. "Isn't it foolish to talk like that? I'm sure your father and mother are longing for you to come home." "My mother may be, but my father—" "Yes, your father," repeated Ravenscroft. "I suppose you'll think me a prig, and be angry at what seems like bad taste in speaking, but I cannot help it. If your father saw what I saw last night, it would break his heart." She laughed defiantly. "My father cares nothing for me," she cried. "He tried to treat me as though I were a child, as though I had no mind of my own, as though I were a little pet dog led by a string." "No," said Ravenscroft, "that's false. I have never talked with your father about your reasons for leaving home, but I know you're not speaking the truth. Of course it's not my business, but I tell you plainly I think your behaviour damnable." "What behaviour?" she flashed back. "Your behaviour in leaving your home as you did." "What do you know about it?" Eleanor had become utterly defiant and regardless of consequences. She was more than angry with herself at adopting this attitude, but she wanted to defy Ravenscroft, wanted, in spite of the fact that her heart was even now yearning for him, to assert her independence and to fling back the accusations which she felt hung upon his lips. A score of conflicting passions surged in her heart: love, anger, tenderness, defiance, shame, pride, eagerness to explain, yet a determination never to yield an inch. All worked within her. "What I did after due consideration," she asserted hotly. "My father would not allow me to choose my own friends. He arrogated to himself the right of deciding who my friends should be, where I should go and where I should not go, as though a girl of any individuality will allow herself to be dictated to in that way." "Do you permit me to speak freely, Miss Trelawney?" asked Ravenscroft. "Yes, speak," she laughed defiantly. "Then I tell you this. I think your father was right in insisting on what he did. No girl, if she cares for her own self-respect, should come home in the early hours of the morning and refuse to let her parents know where she has been. No father with right feeling would allow it. And you did these things, Miss Trelawney, and then because your father insisted upon obedience to his will, you aided and abetted your sister in making a mad marriage and left home." "What right have you to say this to me?" And her voice was husky with passion. "The right you gave me a minute ago," he replied. "But that is not all. I have the right of one who once loved you, who months ago idealized you, and who would have given his life to serve you. I know now that my love was hopeless, but I cannot help caring for your welfare. And I say this, Miss Trelawney, you are leading a dangerous life." "What do you know about my life?" she asked. "What I saw last night." "And because of that you came here to insult me?" "No," he replied. "I came as one wishing you well. I came to ask you not to allow yourself to throw away your life." "And because you rendered me a service, you claim the right to dispose of my future, I suppose?" In her mad anger she scarcely knew what words were passing her lips. "I tell you this, Mr. Ravenscroft, I am fully able to take care of myself. and I could, if I felt so disposed, explain everything you saw last night, even to your satisfaction. But I don't feel so disposed, because you have not the right to know. Few girls in London are able to take care of themselves," was his reply, "especially when they are as beautiful as you are. If I had a sister, I would rather see her go into a house infected by smallpox than to see her living amid such companionships as you have chosen." "What do you know about my companionships?" "I know the opinions Miss Tamsin Cory holds. I have heard about Miss Chellew, who occupies these rooms with you. I know men who know Miss Jeffreys and her friends, and Mrs. Gracechurch, who was divorced only a few months ago." "How do you know these things?" "Because I have made it my business to find out," and his voice was as defiant as hers. "If a woman lives in infectious houses, Miss Trelawney, the likelihood is that she will catch the disease. But I did not come here to quarrel with you. I came because I could not help it." And there was a catch in his voice as he uttered the last words. She looked at him quickly, searchingly. There was something in his tones that made her heart throb madly. Again her anger died down, and a great longing came into her heart to defend, to justify herself, to prove to him that she was not what she imagined in her terror he thought she was. "I know you're thinking about what you saw last night," she then said. "Let me tell you this, then. Although the circumstances were, yes, horrible, my mother has no reason to blush for me. I went, where I did, to obtain a post. I went in the hope of helping Peg. The rest was hideous, I know, but as far as I am concerned, you saw the worst." She half stammered, half sobbed the words that came from her with difficulty, and she could not help a feeling of joy as she saw the changed look in his eyes. "Miss Trelawney," he said quietly, "I never thought harm of you that way. I couldn't. But will you not go back to your father?" "No," she replied obstinately. She was afraid she had said too much, and yet did not know wherein she had made a mistake. Her pride was surging back again now, and with that pride a sense of defiance. "I know what my father thinks of me, and I will not go back like a prodigal child, even although he might kill the fatted calf for me." And she laughed bitterly. "All I want, Mr. Ravenscroft," she went on, "is the means to live my own life." "Then you are leaving Speke and Burnham's?" "How did you know?" "I am trying to put two and two together," was his answer. "They are cutting down expenses," replied Eleanor, "and as a consequence some of their staff is being discharged." "That's not true," replied Ravenscroft. "I know young Speke very well. It's one of the most prosperous firms in the city, and there is no thought of cutting down expenses." Then, but she did not say more. The truth flashed across her mind. "I have to leave there anyhow. I must. I could not go back." Again she noted the peculiar flash of his eyes. She felt that he knew more than he said. He rose to his feet. "I cannot persuade you to go back to your home, then?" he said. She shook her head. "May I tell your father and mother that I have seen you?" "No, I hope you'll tell them nothing." "Nothing?" "No, nothing." He held out his hand to her. "Good morning, Miss Trelawney," he said. "I hope you'll forgive my coming, and of course I'd no right to speak to you as I did. Will you forgive me?" Her eyes were drawn to his as he spoke, and something overmastered her. She knew not what. She felt that tears were welling up, that her lips were trembling. He held her hand in his. "Will you not tell me that you forgive me?" he said. "Go, go, please go." And snatching her hand away from his, she flung herself on the chair, and burying her face in her hands, sobbed as though her heart would break. "Miss Trelawney," said Rod Ravenscroft anxiously, "are you not well? Tell me." "Go, go, please go," she sobbed. He stood looking at her for a few seconds as if undecided what to do. Then, with a sigh, he opened the door and passed out, while she continued to sob as though her heart would break. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Prodigal Daughters by Joseph Hocking. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kate Follis. Chapter 24. Peggy's Romance Fades. "Something will have to be done," said Jim Barnes, who had been standing for a long time, sullen and silent, looking into vacancy. Peg did not reply. "Have you nothing to say? Why, we're right up against it. We've got to do something. We owe 3 weeks' rent and this pile of bills. I can see nothing for it but a moonlight flitting." "What do you mean by that?" "Clearing out. We have no money, and you won't do anything." "What can I do?" And the girl's tones were sullen and defiant. "Do?" he said with an oath. "You could do a lot, but you'll do nothing. You're willing to sponge upon me for everything." "Sponge upon you? Be careful what you say, Jim." "Why should I be careful?" he asked. "Besides, it's true." "You didn't talk like that when I lived at home," she protested. "You told me you were earning good money, and that it would be the joy of your life to buy things for me, and now—" She shrugged her shoulders. Barnes laughed brutally. "Yes, and a nice fool I made of myself," he said. "Instead of marrying a girl with money, as I thought, she hasn't got a sou." "I had nearly £30, and I gave you every penny of it." "£30? What's that?" sneered Barnes. "It all went in a week or two. Oh, you throw up that to me, do you? Your dirty £30. You paid me £30 to take you, did you? And a nice bargain I made of it. Spent it all in less than a month in theatres and dinners. Good Lord, do you think I could keep that up? People who have got extravagant ideas should pay for them. You would never go into the balcony. It was always the dress circle or the stalls for you. You would never go to the movies. They were too common for your ladyship. You must have a regular play. You would never go to a Jolly 10 sociable. Nothing but a high-priced affair would suit you, and I had to pay for it. Of course, people who went to ordinary dances weren't good enough for you. Let me tell you this, madam, my sisters go to them, and they're as good as you." Peg did not reply. "Yes, as good as you, for all your fine name and aristocratic connections. Aristocratic connections, indeed. Fat lot of good they are to me." "You were eager enough to get them," Peggy retorted. "Oh, cut that!" cried Barnes. "I'm just sick of it all. Yes, I know I was a tomfool. I ought to have known better than to marry a proud minx like you. But there, we must do something. We can't stay on here. Look at this letter." After this, there was a silence between them for perhaps a minute. Then Barnes burst out. "We shall have to do it." "What?" she asked. "Go home to Camden Town." "I won't," she cried passionately. "I simply won't." "Won't you? Why, you silly fool, we can live there rent free. That will mean more than £2 a week difference to us. Mother's got a spare room we can have, and I'll pay her something for keeping us. In fact, we can rub along then." "I won't," repeated Peggy angrily. "I simply won't." "Why won't you?" "I couldn't live day by day with your mother and sisters." "Couldn't you indeed? They're as good as you are, and a jolly sight better. My sisters are self-respecting girls. They earn their own living and keep the house going. That's more than you do." "You may say what you like," cried Peggy, "but I won't do it. You know what they said to me the last time I was there." "That was only their fun," laughed Barnes. "Besides, they're a bit fed up. Who wouldn't be? Of course they thought your father would do the straight thing and come down handsome. If he'd been a gentleman, he would have allowed us, say, £4 a week, and then we could have rubbed along. Besides, what can we do? It's all very well to take the high and mighty style, and say you won't do this and you won't do that, but we've got to pay for these rooms or be kicked out, and we've not got the money, and there are these bills. Oh, what a tomfool I was to marry an extravagant, useless thing like you." "You were glad enough to get me," was Peggy's retort. "Was I?" sneered Barnes. "It was you who did all the courting, dear. I had no need to do any." "Oh, you mean, contemptible outsider!" gasped the girl in her rage. "Look here, none of that," said Barnes, taking a savage stride towards her. "I'm not going to stand any of your cheek. Mean, contemptible outsider, am I? Well, go and live with your mean, contemptible insiders." Peggy stood before him defiant, her eyes flashing. "Don't think you can frighten me," she cried. "You are a mean, contemptible outsider, or you wouldn't speak like that." Barnes caught her roughly by the arm. "Say that again," he said, "and I'll blacken your eye." And he lifted his hand as if to strike her. All the fighting spirit in the girl was aroused, and she felt contaminated by his touch. Pride of race and all the influences of her early associations surged within her. She felt degraded by passing through such scenes, for this was only a repetition of others of a similar nature. But she was not afraid. Something, she knew not what, caused her to defy him and challenge him to do his worst. "Strike me!" she cried, her voice quivering. "Strike me! It's the kind of thing a creature like you would do. But remember, I'll tell my brother John, and I'll tell my father too." "Bah, you daren't! Your brother John!" and Barnes laughed uneasily. "He's afraid to come near me. He remembers the licking I gave him at the Cosmopolitan Hotel months ago." "Yes, I heard about that," answered the girl. "Why, he thrashed you within an inch of your life. Jenkins told me so himself." "Jenkins did he? I'll pay him out for that." "No, then, strike me." And the girl looked fearlessly and defiantly into his face. Barnes dropped her arm and walked away muttering. Things had come to a crisis. The room in which they now lived was not the place to which Barnes had first brought her. That was comparatively comfortable, but it cost more than they could afford to pay, and after much heart-searching on Peggy's part, she had consented to come to their present abode. It was a miserable, squalid place, and the surroundings were anything but savoury. Still, Peggy had consented. Barnes had told her that it need only be for a little time, as he expected a raise in his wages shortly, and when that time came they would be able to return to more comfortable surroundings. But the raise of wages did not come, and even this shabby little room was more than they could pay for. Peggy, like many other girls of her class, was utterly unfit to be a wife. She was young and inexperienced, and had always refused to learn housekeeping. In addition, although her father was not a wealthy man, the family had always been able to live in comfort. She had but little knowledge of the value of money, and did not realize how quickly what seemed to her a large amount could melt away. Moreover, having been brought up as she had at first protested against going to cheap restaurants and cheap places of amusement, and for a time Barnes had yielded to her. But little by little facts stared her in the face. For the first 2 months after their marriage Barnes still appeared to her a gay Lothario. She was still under the spell of his handsome presence and high-flown talk. But in time she became disillusioned. She saw the kind of man to whom she had linked her life, realized how utterly different he was from those of her own class. She could not help seeing that he was a common, vulgar braggart. They had scarcely a taste in common, and to all intents and purposes they spoke a different language. But she would not admit this even to herself. By nature she was self-willed and obstinate, and she would not confess that she had made a mistake in marrying. With a kind of doggedness, therefore, which sometimes almost amounted to heroism, she tried to shut her eyes to his real nature and to be a good wife to him. In this, however, she was only partially successful. As the glamour of her marriage passed, and the ugly spectres of poverty and brutalism appeared, she grew hard and sullen. In fact, she was fast awakening to the grim reality of the life she had chosen. Shortly after the visit which her father and mother paid her, she received a letter from the latter, telling her that if ever she was in trouble, she must let her know. She also stated that while her father still kept his doors open to her, they would forever remain closed to Barnes. This man he would neither admit to his house nor recognize in any way. Her mother had also asked her if she might come to see her. The letter was possibly not wisely written. Certain it is that Peggy, angered by the insult which she considered had been offered to her husband, had written defiantly to her mother, declaring that she needed neither the help nor the recognition of any one at Hampstead, and she would not have it if it were offered to her. She also stated that by her husband's wish, seeing her father's house was closed to him, their house was closed to them, and to John, especially to John. Barnes had been very angry when she had told him what she had done. Even yet, that gentleman had hopes of a recognition taking place, and he thought Peggy had made it impossible by what he called her damn silly pride. But now things had come to a crisis. Barnes had received no raise in salary, and debts stared them in the face. With the romance of marriage entirely gone, the shabby sordidness of their surroundings hardened Peggy. A month before this, Barnes had suggested that they should go and live with his people at Camden Town, and she had refused. And as week after week he still harped upon this string, she, while her defence became weaker and weaker, loathed the idea more and more. "We must do something," grumbled Barnes at length, after striding around the room. "There's one thing you can do." "What?" he asked. "You can do with a little less whiskey. Only 2 days ago I asked you for a new pair of gloves, and you told me you couldn't afford it, but you're able to pay 16 shillings for a bottle of whiskey." "Look here," cried Barnes, "I'm not going to do without a drop of whiskey for you or anyone. Besides, a man must offer a friend a drink if he comes to see him, and I tell you this." He stopped suddenly, as if a new thought had struck him, and after a few seconds' silence he went on in more conciliatory tones. "Look here, Peg, old girl," he said, "we are in a bad way. You must forgive me if I spoke to you a bit hasty just now, but I've my pride the same as you have. Of course things haven't turned out as we expected. I tell you straight, I did hope your father would have been reasonable. I didn't think he'd carry things to such a length as he has, and I thought after he'd got used to the idea he'd have caved in. But he hasn't. Now, I'm as proud as Lucifer in some things, but it's no use being silly." "You told me you were going to have a raise of salary," snapped Peggy. "I thought I was, but business is bad, and I'll tell you straight, I dare not ask for more money. The governor gave me a hint only today that he might soon ask me to get another place, and if he did, I don't know where I could get one. Jobs ain't going begging now like they were. See?" "You mean that you might be out of work?" asked Peggy. "That's what I do mean, old girl, and then we should be in the soup. Head over ears in the soup. I'm sorry, Peg, really downright sorry." The girl looked with abject misery towards the fireplace. "Come, Peg, can't you help me out?" asked Barnes. "How can I help you out?" "Swallow your pride a bit. Of course I couldn't do it after what your father said to me. No man of fine feelings could. He insulted me, while your brother called me names which no man of such a sensitive nature as mine could stand. No, I'd rather die than ask any of them for a penny. But you could, Peg. It's your right. You've done nothing to disgrace them, and I say you have a moral right to a quarter of your father's fortune, whatever it is." "What do you mean by that?" asked the girl. "Peg, be sensible. You wouldn't be asking for charity or anything of that sort. You'd be simply claiming what's your own. It's your father's duty to make you an allowance." Again the girl's temper flared up. "Do you mean to suggest," she cried, "that I go to my father and ask him that?" "I didn't say your father," said Barnes coaxingly, "but your mother. She's still soft on you, Peg, and she would not turn a deaf ear to you. For the love you bear me, old girl, go and ask her for a bit of help." "I'll starve first," cried the girl. "That's your pride, is it? You'd see me, after all you've said to me months ago, go like a beggar to my father's house? You're meaner than I thought." "Then starve!" cried Barnes with an angry oath. He seized his hat from a peg as he spoke, and put on his overcoat. "Where are you going?" asked the girl. "Where I like," was his reply. "Do you think I'm going to stay here to be insulted by a proud, penniless, bad-tempered thing like you? If I can't get comfort at home, I'll go where I can get it." He slammed the door as he spoke and left the girl alone. He came back again after a few seconds, however. "Look here, Peg," he cried, "you'll be reasonable, won't you?" "Not in the way you suggest," she said. "I won't." "Then ask your sister to help us. She's got money." "She hasn't," cried the girl. "She's only her salary, and it's barely enough for her to live on." "That won't do," and Barnes laughed meaningly. "She gets money all right, Peg. I met a man only today who saw her having supper at a gay place with her boss. We know what that means. She's got money right enough. I tell you—" But he did not proceed further. There was a look in Peggy's eyes which made him afraid. "Go," she said hoarsely. "Go before I kill you." Why, you little spitfire," he muttered. But he obeyed her. Again he closed the door behind him and left the girl to her thoughts. It was now about 9 o'clock at night, and the neighbourhood in which Barnes had taken up his abode was gloomy and cheerless. When he left Peggy, it was with the determination to seek out some of his pals, as he called them, and make a night of it. "Let her think what she likes," he muttered angrily. "I'm going to enjoy myself." A few minutes later, however, he changed his mind. "I believe it could be managed," he said aloud, "and I'm not going to cut off my nose to spite my face. He's a general now, and all sorts of a big gun. I've gone the wrong way to work in the past. I've taken the high hand, but now I'll do the humble touch." The idea seemed to please him the more he thought about it. When at length he found himself at Charing Cross, his mind seemed fully made up. "At any rate, nothing venture, nothing won," he reflected as he entered the subway. "And if I can once get the thin edge of the wedge in, the rest will come easy." 20 minutes later he was at Hampstead, and then, with a fast-beating heart, he made his way to the house which had once been his wife's home. As he entered the gateway, he saw that several windows of the house were ablaze with light, and in the stillness of the night there came to him the sound of merry music and gay laughter. "They're not breaking their blooming hearts anyhow," he said to himself. "His youngest daughter has to think where her next meal is coming from, while he lives in a style like this." A minute later he rang the bell, which was opened by a maid he had not seen there before. "Is General Trelawney at home?" he asked. "Yes," replied the girl, "but he's engaged." "Have you company?" And he gave the girl a smile, which he thought was very entrancing. "Yes," was the reply. "I'm sorry to call at such an inopportune time," he said in his most lordly manner, "but my business is very urgent indeed. Won't you ask him to see me for just a minute?" The girl looked at him closely and tried to sum him up. He was not quite a gentleman, but he did not suggest the vagrant or the beggar. "If you will ask him to see me for just a minute," he persisted. "What name?" asked the girl. "The name doesn't matter at all," said Barnes, "but my business is exceedingly important, and I'll only keep the General 5 minutes." Barnes stood waiting while the girl went into the adjoining room, and he noticed that the music and laughter ceased. Evidently the General was asking some questions, and Barnes, dire as was the predicament in which he was placed, felt like running away. But before he could do so, the General stepped into the hall. This was dimly lit, and thus, while the outline of Barnes's figure was plainly to be seen, his features were not easily recognizable. "You wish to see me?" And the General gave only a careless glance towards a tall figure which stood waiting. "Will you come this way?" He led the way into an empty room and switched on the light. Then he turned to his visitor. "Oh, it's you, is it?" And a look flashed into his eyes which was anything but pleasant. For a few seconds he stood without speaking further. He seemed to be debating what to do. Doubtless he was angry that Barnes should have called on him. Remembering all that had taken place, it was no wonder. But there was something else expressed in his face. Anger was followed by a look of yearning and tenderness. He remembered the little maid who long years before he had fondled and caressed, and his heart went out to her now. But for that he would have shown Barnes the door, and it was this fact that gave his visitor the opportunity he sought. "What do you want?" he asked. End of chapter 24.